So we'll be going through Amos 6 today. Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria, the notable men of the first of the nations, to whom the house of Israel comes. Pass over to Calneh, and see, and from there go to Hamath the Great, then go down to Gath of the Philistines. Are you better than these kingdoms? Or is their territory greater than your territory? O you who put far away the day of disaster and bring near the seat of violence. Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp and like David invent for themselves instruments of music, who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, they shall now be the first of those who go into exile, and the revelry of those who stretch themselves out shall pass away. The Lord God has sworn by himself, declares the Lord, the God of hosts. I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his strongholds, and I will deliver up the city and all that is in it. And if 10 men remain in one house, they shall die. And when one's relative, the one who anoints him for burial, shall take him up to bring the bones out of the house, and shall say to him who is in the innermost parts of the house, is there still anyone with you? He shall say, no. And he shall say, silence, we must not mention the name of the Lord. For behold, the Lord commands, and the great house shall be struck down into fragments, and the little house into bits. Do horses run on rocks? Does one plow there with oxen? But you have turned justice into poison, and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. You who rejoice in Lodabar, who say, have we not by our own strength captured Carnaim for ourselves? For behold, I will raise up against you a nation, O house of Israel, declares the Lord, the God of hosts, and they shall oppress you from Lebo Hamath to the brook of the Arabah.
We wanna see your justice come out here. Let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream. Let justice roll. Let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream.
It's a joy to just be with you all. I do want to just give God glory for a second for showing up and coming through in regards to a place to gather. It's been a huge just blessing to have that. It's also been really cool to see us being able to partner with other churches. Both of our places to gather have been other churches that kind of said, hey, we can help you out there. And so we know and believe that it's going to take multiple gospel-centered churches to see Decatur flooded with the glory of God. And so it's not just up to us. And that's been really encouraging for me, especially us being a new church plant here in the city. And so just want to praise God for that. It's exciting to see what God is doing. Also wanted to ask you guys to continue to be in prayer for both Kevin and I as we just have more conversations about what it looks like. We are still praying through maybe partnership with the Boys and Girls Club, have some other opportunities as far as a partnership where we can gather and also be engaged on mission. And so there's just a lot of decisions. I know this week we had a lot of different conversations, and at times I just felt absolutely overwhelmed. So one, I'm thankful for plurality of leadership, thankful for Kevin, but also just want to ask you guys, we can feel your prayers and want to ask you to continue to do that as well. So we love you all. We're thankful for you. So I've really been enjoying going through the book of Amos a lot. It's been really neat to just walk through this book. I think we have about 4 weeks left after this week, and then we'll have something we do before we head into our Advent series. I can't believe we're almost at the end of 2019, just joking, 2020. But yeah, so I've been really excited about it, but one of the things, I'm going to let that go. I promise, Chris. That's really bad. So one of the things, though, about walking through a book expositionally is that sometimes I feel like we can miss the big picture, right? Because we're kind of diving in week after week. But remember, this is a collection of prophecies that are all meant to kind of flow together. And so I encourage you, if you have an opportunity as we finish up this series the next month or so, to maybe once a week, just read through the entire book of Amos. It's only 9 chapters. It wouldn't take that long. And that kind of help you get the feel of this unified prophecy throughout the whole book. And bonus, you get the hope at the end every time you read it. So it's always good to have that. It's in some respects, it's been almost at times, I don't want to just throw around the word depression, but like don't know of another word, but a depressing book to go through, right? There's a lot of darkness, but there is hope there, and we hope you see that week after week. Last week, we saw what's called an oracle of woe, and the reason I mention that is that's going to flow right into our text for this week. It is one unified prophecy. Now, if you don't know what a woe is, I mentioned this last week, but it simply means great sorrow. And so there would be this pronouncement or oracle of great sorrow about a group of people or a person, about something that was going to happen or something that had already happened. And so last week there was this oracle woe at the end of chapter 5, the second half of it. It was on those who desired the day of Yahweh. While there was injustice flowing in the land, he was like, whoa, you really don't want Yahweh to show up when there's injustice in the land. And we looked at that last week. And so this week we're going to see two more woes. The oracles of woe are going to continue. There's going to be one toward those in positions of power in both Judah and Israel, the northern and southern kingdom, and then those that are in positions of privilege in society. And so I think this week could be especially relevant for our context. The reason why Amos begins to address this week, not only those who are actively engaged in oppressing people and active workers of injustice, but also those who just kind of sit idly by and are apathetic about injustice going on around us. And knowing most of us, I don't know any of you that are actively engaged in the oppression of other people, but maybe we find ourselves apathetic or find ourselves kind of bothered when people bring it up and not really wanting to hear about it. We might find ourselves in positions of power or privilege, but being apathetic about what's going on. And so I think this text could be very helpful for us to say, what do we do when we find ourselves in this position? So this week, we're just going to kind of walk through the text verse by verse, kind of see the various themes and instructions that are there for us. And then obviously, as we do every week, we're going to see how this drives us to Jesus, because he's the only hope we have. Like, if I've not learned anything else through this series, it's that Jesus is the hope for injustice and brokenness in the world. So let's dive right in, looking at the first oracle of woe pronounced by Amos in verse 1 of chapter 6. He says, "Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria, the notable men of the first of the nations, to whom the house of Israel comes." Now, there's a lot of different woes in Scripture, and anytime we come across a woe, a couple clarifying questions could be helpful for us. First of all, who is the woe pronounced to? So who is it directed toward? And then what are they doing that's warranted that woe to be directed toward them? What are they doing? That can kind of help us. So right away in the first line, we see Amos is kind of broadening his audience in a sense. He includes Zion, which was located in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, if you remember, most of Amos's prophecy has kind of been directed toward the northern kingdom, okay? And that's most of his prophecy. But now he kind of broadens his audience to include Judah as well. And so he could be doing this to rein in his listeners. We've seen him do this in the prophecy so far, because the northern kingdom, anytime he mentions woe or judgment to the southern kingdom, they'd have been like, yeah, get them. And then he reins them in to then the next line, he says, woe to those that are on the mountains of Samaria. And so he includes them as well, those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria. That was right there in the northern kingdom. And so he's addressing all of the nation of Israel at this point, both the northern and southern kingdom. Remember, there was division there, but he's addressing them all. But let's look a little deeper and see who he's specifically addressing. He says those that are at ease and those who feel secure. And then he says specifically the notable men of the first of the nation. So the best of the best, to whom the house of Israel comes. So all the house of Israel look to these people for their leadership. This is the best of the best in these two kingdoms. The people in positions of power. Maybe they're priests, maybe they're political leaders, maybe they're military leaders, right? Those who were called to lead the nation in the ways of Yahweh, but instead were simply at ease, taking it easy while injustice was plaguing their land. See, Amos knew that as went the leadership, so went the land, and that the best people to actually put an end to this injustice were those that actually had the power, those that held the power in the community. See, there's definitely a temptation for those in authority to abuse their power. That's a real temptation, and it's something that we have to talk about. It happens. But there's probably a bigger temptation for those in power to not use their authority at all. to remain silent and passive in the face of injustice, to just pretend it doesn't exist and to kind of keep things as the status quo. See, the answer when authority is abused or people are being oppressed is not to simply cast off all authority, because we believe and we see from the scriptures that authority is God-given. It starts with God himself. And so the answer is for authority to be used rightly, to be used to speak out on behalf of the oppressed and the hurting, for those who hold no power, for those who have no voice to speak out. And this is exactly what wasn't happening in this country. Those who were in positions of power were ignoring it. And this is what Amos pronounces this woe about. That's why accountability and humility is required for those who hold positions of power. That's why I'm thankful for God's church that in his wisdom, he set up a plurality of elders to lead his church. I mean, it's why I'm grateful for the checks and balances that we have in our country. And God knows our country's not perfect, but I'm thankful for those checks and balances that help us out in so many ways. Now, no earthly authority will ever get it right, but there is a healthy authority and unhealthy authority for sure. And one of the marks of unhealthy authority, and we need to see this so we can recognize it, is being apathetic toward those who can't do anything for them, to those who can't help them gain more power. They really have no help for them to spread their power. And Amos has something to say to these people who are ignoring the needy around them. See, power in and of itself is not evil. Power is a gift given by God to be stewarded for the flourishing of humanity and for the glory of God. But unfortunately, most of humanity takes any power they have and misuses it and uses it to advance their own kingdom instead, or their own interest. In verse 2, we're not going to read it, but we get a hint at the pride found in these leaders who are apathetic toward injustice around them. Amos names a few kingdoms that most likely had fallen, and he lets them know, do you think you're better than these kingdoms? Are you so confident that you think you can just sit there and ignore the injustice in your land and your kingdom not be in trouble? And then you look at what those in positions of power in verse 3 are doing. It says they're putting far away the day of disaster and bringing near the seat of violence. Now, that could be a little confusing. It was the first time I read it. But what's going on here is that these people, on one hand, were ignoring or putting away the day of disaster, which is flowing from this day of Yahweh we just talked about last week. And so they're ignoring it, putting it off, pretending that it's not going to exist. I mean, they're looking around at their land with their military might, and they think Amos is stupid. And you say, yeah, God's going to show up, but what's he going to do? We're doing fine. Look around. Everything looks great. We've got the blessings of God, right? So they were putting away the day of disaster, and they were ushering in or bringing near the seat, or that just means reign of violence. And so we don't know whether or not these people in positions of power were actively, doing violent acts towards other people, but we do know that Amos holds them accountable because they were in the positions of power, and they at least, at minimum, allowed it, and God holds them responsible. See, the goal here, and we're going to see this, is not for them to get it perfect or for them to be able to end all injustice. They're humans. They only have so much power. We've seen that only one person can do that. That's God himself. But those in positions of power were called to, at minimum, care, to be aware of their power, to be empathetic, and to use their power in the best way possible, to steward it for the good of those around them in the best way that they could. And then in verse 4, we see the last oracle of woe in this book. So during this section, chapter 5 and 6, we see these three woes kind of together. And this is the last one we see in the book. It's verses 4 through 6. He says, woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, eat lambs from the flock, calves from the midst of the stall, sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, like David invent for themselves instruments of music, drink wine in bowls or by the bowlful, as some translations say, and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. So Amos moves on from addressing those that are in positions of power to those who are in positions of privilege. Now, most likely, we don't know for sure, there's probably overlap in these two groups of people, right? Some of these same people who held the positions of power were also in this category. But clearly, he's addressing a group of people who hold this kind of form of economic privilege in this society. These people have ornate beds of ivory. They have apparently enough time to sit around all day and just lie on these beds, watch Netflix, do whatever they want, right? They eat the finest foods, whatever they want. They're sitting around and singing these idle songs just for fun. They're indulging in wine by the bowlfuls just because they can. I mean, Amos is making it clear that these people seemingly don't have a care in the world. Their main care is just enjoying life, hedonism, just living for pleasure, living for that next party, whatever it is. Now, do you think Amos is maybe just salty, right? He's this prophet. He's been called to, walk around and preach, and he probably doesn't have much money. He's probably got raggedy clothes. And sorry, that's another inside joke. This is why I stick to my notes, because it's very random. But anyways, so maybe Amos is just this broke prophet, right? And so he's kind of mad at these guys, like, man, I wish I had that, cushy life. That's not what's going on. Most likely, Amos is being pretty intentional and poetic here. In this culture, there were, Amos has already been talking a lot about lamentations and destructions and even funerals. And in this culture, funerals were often accompanied by these long feasts, often 7 days long or more. In our culture, we do what's called a repast. I didn't even know what that was till like 2 years ago. But after a funeral, sometimes people come together and have a meal together. Well, it was kind of like that, but on a larger scale. And so these feasts were there to kind of help encourage the people who had just lost loved ones. And so they would kind of enjoy these feasts together. They would lament together, but also just enjoy some good food together and have this time to lament and grieve. But instead of seeing this as an opportunity to enter into the suffering of someone else, they're seeing this just as an opportunity to party and get hammered and just enjoy life. I mean, this is how bad the injustice has gone. They're so apathetic to the world around them. They lack so much empathy that even when others are entering into this kind of funeral feast where they lament and grieve, they just worry about what's in it for me. What can I do? What can I enjoy? And Amos's biggest grief seems to be that they are doing all this and living over the top, luxurious lives while not being one bit grieved over the ruin of Joseph, which is just another name for the northern kingdom. These people do not care at all that injustice is happening as long as it doesn't affect them. And I think about us in our culture today. There's many of us whose first response to cries of injustice is arrogance and apathy. And we wouldn't ever call it that. But what happens is when we hear cries of injustice, our first response is to oftentimes dismiss it. And I've found myself there as well, especially if it doesn't affect us directly. We might dismiss the cries of racial injustice, the cries of sexual abuse, the realities of abortion, and the list could go on. And as long as it doesn't affect us, as long as it's something that's over there, then we're okay with kind of ignoring it and going about our own lives. But the reality is for those that are in the position of being on the receiving end of injustice, they don't have that opportunity. They don't have the opportunity to be at ease, to just kind of go back to their lives and pretend it doesn't exist. Their cries go up night and day. And as the covenant people of God, we're called to listen. We're called to engage, not just tune it out and go back to the partying while the world is hurting around us. I mean, often our response when we hear cries of injustice is dismissive at best and maybe judgmental at worst. I'll hear statements like, well, if they had just blank, then that wouldn't have happened. Or, well, if they wouldn't have been in that situation, then that wouldn't have happened. And that those statements, if we really think about it, okay, and I've made those statements before, so this isn't to condemn you, but if we think about those statements reveal our arrogance because we're saying that we would never be in that situation. We would have made the right decision if we were in that situation. And it reveals that we really don't think that we're better than being in that situation. And when God commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves, it doesn't come with the stipulation that only counts if your neighbor never acted in a way that you think you wouldn't act. Well, I love my neighbor as long as, they don't do something that I wouldn't do, right? And for those of us who find ourselves in a position of privilege, whether that be economic, ethnic, or anything else, the goal is not to feel guilty about that. It's to recognize it just as it is with power and to steward it to help the world around us. So whatever that might be, for you that might be economic. It might be that you have been blessed, right? We could use that word because it's not as much of a buzzword, right? Unfortunately, culture has hijacked some words, and so we've got to be mindful of that. But maybe you've been blessed with a good job, and so you're able to have economic blessing. Well, you're not given that to hold onto that and be a cul-de-sac and say, let me just build my little kingdom that's so shallow and empty. You're given that to be a blessing to the world around you, especially those who are on the other end of the spectrum. See, when we're cold and indifferent toward those who are facing injustice, we're revealing our pride and arrogance, our sense of entitlement that deep down we really think we earned this. We really think that any blessing we have, we earned it, right? We deserve it. We're entitled to it. Why would anyone else why would I share that with anybody else? We've earned it all. The reality is, though, that we have absolutely nothing that we've not been given. There is no position, there is no power, there is no privilege that has not been granted to you by your Creator, and to whom much is given, much is required. And that's why Amos is dealing with these people and pronouncing great sorrow upon them. They had been given much. They were the chosen people of God, the covenant people of Israel, been blessed with abundant just military strength and victories and just all these things. And instead they just used it for their own purposes, instead of using it to spread the glory of God to all the other nations, which is what they were called to do. In verse 7, Amos says that these people that are the best of the best will also be the first to go into exile, and that their revelry, their partying, their ease will pass away. In verse 8, Amos gets direct with God's hatred of pride, which is the root, as we've seen, behind this apathy and indifference toward injustice. Look at verse 8. It says, "The Lord God has sworn by himself, declares the Lord, declares Yahweh, the God of hosts, I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his strongholds, and I will deliver up the city and all that is in it." There are not many things that God says he abhors, but pride is at the top of that list. See, God knows that pride destroys not only our own hearts, but it also destroys the world around us, and so he hates when it exists. Pride takes credit for things that originate and flow from God and tries to steal his glory and take credit for what he's done. And as others have pointed out, it's the root sin behind all other sin. Pride places ourselves on the throne and pushes God off and says, I know what's best in the world around us. And it leads to destruction every time. See, these people were placing boast in themselves and in their flimsy strongholds that they had fashioned and made that they thought would give them the comfort and the security that they wanted. They thought they were invincible. God says they're not. And he warns them that because of the apathy they had toward injustice and because of their arrogance, that total destruction is coming. And by his grace, if we could see this as God's grace, he's revealing to us the helplessness of trying to place our boast in anything but God himself, in strongholds built by hands of men, whether they be our hands or others. Verses 9 and 10 tell of this. Honestly, if you read it, it's kind of a weird scene. Culturally, it would have made more sense. There's 10 men left in this house. And so they're sitting in this house. So the imagery is that there's destruction all around, but there's one house that's left, and there's 10 men left in that, which was the smallest band of soldiers that could exist in this culture. And so maybe there's still hope that they could win this battle. But then these 10 men die. And then there's a couple distant relatives that come to get the remains for the burial. And culturally, what would happen, it was very common to call on Yahweh for mercy or as a part of lamentation, for maybe him to stop the destruction. But they don't even want to do that. And that's why this guy says silence. We didn't want to mention his name because there's fear that more judgment would come on them. And as we've seen, these people that long for the day of Yahweh because they thought everything was going to be okay, because they thought they were good with God, but they were practicing injustice around them, that they don't even want to call his name. It's come full circle. And Amos is being intentional here. If you also remember the funeral feast where people were supposed to lament and grieve, but they only cared about partying and comfort, in this scene there is so much destruction that even the most prideful, the most arrogant will be humbled and the partying will cease. There will not be a word uttered because Yahweh has showed up and he has dealt with injustice. In verse 11, he gives a picture of the totality of destruction. We won't read it. And in verse 13, Amos brilliantly and sarcastically shows them the hopelessness and flimsiness of their trust in themselves and their own conquest. Look at verse 13. He says, "You who rejoice in Lodabar, who say, have we not by our own strength captured Carnaim for ourselves?" So they're very proud of these cities that they had conquered. They're rejoicing over these cities. And Amos is being very poetic here. The word Lodabar actually means nothing in Hebrew. So Amos is saying, you might think you're rejoicing in your might, but it's actually nothing. You're rejoicing in nothing. It's in the whole scheme of things, not that big of a deal that you won this city, Lodabar. And then he ends our chapter in verse 14 with another prediction of judgment, when the tables would be turned and another nation would come in and do to Israel what they had been doing to everyone around them. And as we read this judgment predicted in Amos, we might have a little bit of tension in our hearts But that's exactly what we need. See, God, by his grace, wants to make sure that we see the ridiculousness that it is to seek to find our own pleasure, our security, or our comfort in anything that we create or build up in anything outside of God, because trust in things of this age will always let us down every time and will always lead to the destruction of ourselves or others. And when we get a glimpse by the grace of God from Amos into God's vantage point, we can actually agree with him and say, that is absurd and that is ridiculous. Amos makes it very pointed in verse 12. Let's go back and look at it. He says, do horses run on rocks? Does one plow there with oxen? But you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. So he asked these examples that, again, would have made sense to this culture, two rhetorical questions that the answer was clearly no to. And he's used this method before in his prophecies where he asked these questions that the answer is no to show the absurdity and make sure they're agreeing with him before he gives them the truth that they might not want to agree with. And so the obvious answer to, do horses run on rocks and does one plow there with oxen? Some translators believe that this is, does one plow with oxen in the sea? Either way, it's this absurd thing. It would have been this ridiculous scoffing like, no, that would be stupid. That would be absolutely absurd. That's a better word probably if you have kids, right? We're not supposed to say stupid. But it's like, you wouldn't do that, right? Like maybe a modern day example would be if I stood up here and was like, hey, would anyone get out a lawnmower and mow a field of rocks? You'd be like, that's stupid. I never thought about that. Or maybe, would anyone try to trim the ocean with a weed eater? Right? And even as I say it, you're like, where did you come up with those examples? I don't know. They're stupid. They would never happen. You can't come up with an example because it doesn't, like that's what he's saying. Like this would never happen. No one would ever do this. But that's how stupid we are when we turn justice into poison and what's supposed to be flourishing in the fruit of righteousness into wormwood, which was just a bitter, woody bush. He says that justice is being turned into poison. The word justice in Hebrew, Jay will mention this a few weeks back, it's mishpat. And it has this idea not just of like not doing evil, but absolute flourishing for the world around them. So flourishing and life. And what was supposed to, Israel was supposed to be this place where justice flowed from their midst as the covenant people of God. Instead, there's poison. And there's death. And you've taken righteousness, the fruit of righteousness, which was this sweet gift to you, this place where life and joy, seek me and find life, seek good and find life, as we've seen in Amos. It's the place where true pleasure would flow from. And instead, you've turned it to wormwood, which again is this bitter thing, this woody shrub known for its bitterness. So instead of flourishing in life, you've brought poison, death, and bitterness. And this is the fruit of your own arrogance and your apathy toward injustice. Again, Amos is trying to bring Israel to a place where they're grieved and to repentance. See, Amos has something to say for these people that are building these fine homes, living these luxurious lives, and amassing more and more power, while all around him there are those who are hurting. There are those who are being oppressed, and we're not even grieved. We're not even bothered. As long as it doesn't affect me, I'm good. My life's good. See, I can't stand up here and give you all the solutions for battling injustice. Like, I can't even tell you which issues to get involved in, and we've talked about the messiness of it, but I can, at a minimum, on the authority of the Word of God, say that if we can look at injustice and not be bothered, not be grieved, then we're missing part of what it means to be the covenant people of God. We're missing a key part of what it means to enter into the sufferings of others like Jesus entered into ours. See, some of the answer to maybe being able to show more empathy is to, be informed. We hear that a lot, raise awareness, and that can be a good start. I'm not saying that's bad. I think that's a good thing to learn about the injustices in our society. But honestly, ultimately that can't sustain us because you can go down that rabbit trail and you can never end. There is injustice in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our country, and all across the world. And so I'm not saying we stick our head in the sands. We've already addressed that. But what I am saying is that can only sustain us so much. If we really want to grow in empathy and love for others who are hurting, especially for those who are different than us, that we have a harder time seeing them in our own lives, and so we don't show empathy. If we want to grow in that, the answer is to look deeply in the person and work of Jesus. See, Jesus, more than anybody, more than any of us, held position of power and privilege. He sat at the Father's right hand. He was there from the beginning, speaking life into existence and creation, enjoying perfect communion in the Trinity, having access to all the privileges of divine sonship. He was and is the heir of all that the Father had in store. And he could have kept that to himself and just ignored all the injustice going on in this world. But as we saw when we preached through Philippians, the King of the world laid all that aside to enter into the human experience. He laid aside his own interest. And instead of using his power and his privilege to serve his own ends, he used it to serve ours. And he took upon himself the form of a slave. He willingly humbled himself to the lowest of the low. And then he became one with our suffering and our sin. And that's why he can empathize with us. We don't have a high priest that can't empathize and sympathize with our weaknesses because he's entered into that. He's felt our weakness and pain. And when he lived on this life in his incarnation, he showed us a greater vision of leadership. One that used the power and privilege that he had, not for selfish gain, but to serve others, to speak truth to those who abused power, and ultimately to offer redemption to the oppressor and true freedom to the oppressed, all in the good news of Jesus. We see it most clearly when he's granted all authority from the Father as he's in the upper room with his disciples, and he's given all authority, and he takes that authority and he washes the feet of his disciples, even the one who was going to betray him. When he could have rightly used his power and privilege to escape the suffering of the cross, he could have called 10,000 angels. Instead, he walked right into it, knowing that by his suffering, many would be made righteous. And as Jesus on the cross faced the poison of the worst injustice ever, his own death, and as he faced the bitterness not of a woody shrub, but on the wooden cross, and he faced the worst that evil could throw at him, he was offering a way of redemption for all who would believe in him. This is the hope that we have. And in the resurrection, he undoes what humanity did. He undoes what we do. He takes poison and he turns it back to flourishing and justice. He takes the bitterness of our sin and he turns it into sweet righteousness. And he beats death, hell, and the grave and shows us this whole new way of living. And he also stands himself as the power to actually live that life. Change can actually happen. Hard hearts can actually turn to hearts of flesh that can be molded. Like we've seen it by the power of the gospel. Jesus can do his work. And in the work of Jesus, we're now free to find our comfort and our ease and our rest and our luxury and our power, and all of our boast, all of our pride is found in him alone. And so we no longer have to fight for and cling to all these things to fulfill us. We don't have to have the bowl full of wine to make us okay for another day. We have Jesus. That's what we cling to in the here and now, because we know he's coming back to fix it and usher in the final kingdom, where all those things are going to be there. Goodness and life is going to flow. And so we're able to be led by the Spirit in how we steward our power and our privilege and our stuff and our material things that are gifts to be used for the kingdom. We're free to follow the Spirit because we hold it with an open hand. We want to see the kingdom advance. That's why Jesus breathed on his disciples the Spirit and left the Spirit as our comforter and guide. Because guess what? Like if you're sitting there, maybe you've felt some tension, and that's good. Like I think we need to be willing to ask questions about our stuff and about our privilege and about our power. I think that's important. But if I was sitting where you were, I would want some answers, right? Like I would want to just know, like just tell me, give me a new law and I'll follow it. Should I build that new house or not? Should I get those custom cabinets painted or not? Right? Should I take out a car payment or keep breaking down on the side of the road for the sake of the kingdom? Because Dave Ramsey said, I never take out a car payment. Okay, so I'm giving you a hint. I'm asking questions that me and my wife have all asked in the last few years, right? Like, so I'm letting you into a glimpse of where we're at, right? Should I ever eat a steak again while injustice takes place in the world? Can I do that, right? Here's one I haven't asked, but can I play music and dance to the glory of God while there's poverty in the world? Is that okay? Like, can I enjoy life? Can I go to a wedding and dance? Should I just sit at home in sackcloth and ashes? I've not actually considered that, so that's not one. But let me give you the answer to all these questions. I'll help you out. I have no idea. I don't know. But you have the Spirit inside of you, granted by God. There were times where Jesus rested. There were times where he turned the water to wine and he brought the better wine and he partied with everyone else. And there was times where he stopped and he wept with people that wept. He was in tune with the Spirit as he did his work. He was surrendered to the will of the Father. He saw the big picture. We say this here. We play the long game when it comes to injustice. Like ultimately the long game, like when Jesus gets back here. But we want to see foretaste and pockets and pictures. And so we do need to be willing to wrestle through what God's called us to, corporately as a church, with our finances, with our resources, and then individually as a disciple of Jesus. Be willing to ask the questions, do I need this? Could these resources be better stewarded? Like our checkbook, right, or our account transaction, right? Because most of us don't write checks anymore. Like that's a window into what we typically care about. So we can look at that and ask those hard questions. Am I apathetic and indifferent to the hurting in this world? Am I being called to do more in a certain area? We have to at least be willing to ask that of ourselves, because I can promise you, if we do, that's where we'll find true life. As we've moved here in the city, my wife and I are having a house built right now that we hope to live in the rest of our lives, right? And so I'm here preaching this message, and I'm just gonna put it out there. I don't want people to think like we've got to have the best of the best, but here's where we're at. Like our hope is that like we're in this forever. We think it's gonna be the perfect floor plan for our kids to be raised in, but not so big that when they leave, we're like, we got to downsize. Like who knows what God does, but that's our hope. We hope that it is a place to be used for the kingdom, a place of rest for our family, and that we can invite others into, and a hub for mission, that people might be sent out into the kingdom. That's our hope, that's our desire, that's our prayer, but we've got to check ourselves constantly. What do we actually need, and what are we called to? And so we want to wrestle with that. I will say this, like I don't think it's much of I think it's pretty clear that in our country, in our culture, the tendency is probably not one where we've got to encourage our culture to enjoy good gifts. We're pretty good at enjoying good gifts, like video games or like having a drink or whatever it is, having a good steak. Like the tendency leans pretty strongly toward self-indulgence and materialism and finding satisfaction in those things. But let me say the goal here is not guilt, right? I'm not going to be like your mom growing up that would make you feel bad because you didn't finish your sandwich while there were kids starving in Africa, okay? And that's a gross mischaracterization of Africa anyways, but that's another conversation. So that's not what's going on. And it can't be, because again, we know that Jesus partied. We know that Jesus found time to rest. We know that he was relaxed. He trusted his Father. He saw the big picture. See, drinking bowlfuls of wine in and of itself wasn't the problem. At the end of Amos, we actually see a positive vision in the eternal kingdom of the mountains dripping with sweet wine and so abundant that you don't even need a bowl. Like you can just go to the mountains and it's flowing there and you can enjoy it. So that's not the problem. Now, drinking a bowlful by yourself in one sitting might be a problem, but you get the point, okay? It's not that we can't enjoy good gifts given to us by God. That's not what we're saying. We definitely can. That's another sermon for another time. But the message of Amos and the good news of Jesus frees us to know that ultimately our comfort and joy and power doesn't come in these things, it comes in Jesus. So anything in the here and now is simply a gift to be stewarded toward the end of others worship him. So when the Spirit calls us to sell our house and car and move to help rescue women from sex trafficking, we do it. It's okay, let's go. When the Spirit calls us to stay in the same old little American town that we grew up in, that we hate, but calls us to cultivate an environment of rest within our newly remodeled home, we do it. When the Spirit calls us to Sabbath and take a break from social media so we can later hop back in the work of fighting injustice with renewed energy and share those hashtags again, like we do it. We say, okay. When the Spirit calls us to use our brand new car to transport a bunch of little snotty nose like boys and girls to the Boys and Girls Club or run kids home from football practice with stinky equipment, we just say, okay, it's yours, it's not mine. When the Spirit calls us to make a bunch of money, which he might do running successful businesses so we can give more and fund nonprofits and send missionaries to the nations, we say, okay. When the Spirit calls us to say, hey, you've got freed up time, so what is it like to be a foster parent? We say, okay. Because we know ultimate rest, pleasure, and joy come from Jesus, not these things. Our boast is in him alone. That's it. That's all we have to brag about. It's not about us. It's not about our stuff. That's most of the time why we like stuff, because it's a status symbol. And so people could then give us credit and props. It's not about that. Our boast is in Christ alone, and we have a rock solid foundation that cannot be shaken because we know what the end holds. Jesus is coming back. And so that humility, we know we've not been given anything. I'm sorry, we've not earned it. All of it's been given to us, granted by God, any gifts, any resources. And so that humility allows us to show empathy and grieve when people are hurting, to enter into their world, to lay aside privilege, power, control for the sake of the gospel, and to enter into their world like Jesus did ours, to point them to the true giver of hope, the one who turns poison of injustice into flourishing, the one who turns bitterness of oppression into a field of hope. And so my prayer for us as New Eden Church and as individuals is that we would be willing to be spent and used for the sake of gospel advancement, for the flourishing of humanity, and for the glory of God.